My name is Marjorie Kent, and at 63, I've learned to keep my life quiet, almost small, after retiring from the Boise Public Library. I filled my days with simple things that didn't depend on anyone else, morning walks along the Greenbelt, tending to my balcony plants, and reading novels stacked on my nightstand. Peace, I discovered, wasn't about grandeur. It was about not being needed as an emergency fund, not being dragged into someone else's storm. That's why the phone call rattled me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of cold November day when frost lingered even past noon. I was steeping tea, enjoying the stillness, when the screen lit up with my son's name, Ethan. We hadn't spoken much in months, just scattered texts, usually when he needed something practical, an old document, a recipe, a reminder of some account number. Never just to talk. Mom, he said when I answered, his voice brighter than I remembered, almost too warm. How are you? The question itself felt strange, like it belonged to someone else's family. We exchanged pleasantries, though my heart kept its guard. Then he said it. We want you to come to Idaho Falls for Thanksgiving. Harper and I thought it would be nice. I gripped the mug tighter. For years, holidays had been polite obligations. And more often than not, I spent them alone or with friends. Ethan and Harper had built their lives at a distance, sending me pictures of vacations but never invitations to share them. Now, out of nowhere, this. I don't want you to be alone this year, Ethan added quickly, as if anticipating resistance. His tone was smooth, maybe rehearsed. The truth was, part of me ached to say yes immediately. I missed his laugh, even if it had grown sharper over time. I missed the chaos of family noise, the sense of belonging, however fragile. Yet something in his voice, polite, coaxing, made me wary, as though there were strings attached I couldn't see yet. Still, when silence stretched too long, I heard myself agree. I'll come. The tea had gone cold. After I hung up the phone, the apartment felt smaller, as if the call had drawn the walls closer. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the faded tile, and memories began to push their way in, uninvited, but relentless. I thought first of Ethan's college years. He had always been bright, good with numbers, but careless with money. When tuition deadlines arrived, it was my savings that bridged the gap. I took extra hours at the library then, shelving books after closing, telling myself it was worth it to see him graduate without the burden of debt. I never complained, not even when it meant years without a real vacation. Later came his wedding. Harper was lovely in photographs, poised and graceful. Though she never reached for me the way brides often do with their new families, I remember writing the check for their down payment, sliding it across the table in a quiet restaurant. Ethan hugged me tightly. Harper gave me a polite smile, one that stopped at her lips. It was the same smile she wore at every holiday gathering, as though she were tolerating my presence rather than welcoming it. Then, there were the ventures. Ethan called them opportunities restaurants, investments, side projects that promised big returns. I still remember the pit in my stomach each time I withdrew funds from my modest retirement account. I kept telling myself that helping him would keep him steady, that maybe this time would be different. But the ventures collapsed one after another, leaving me with thinner savings and a growing ache of regret. Through it all, Harper's role remained constant, distant, watchful, treating me not as family, but as a resource to be tapped. I caught her once, glancing at me during a dinner as Ethan bragged about a plan I had quietly financed. Her eyes weren't grateful, they were calculating. That night, years ago, I promised myself there would be no more checks, no more withdrawals, no more rescues. Love had already cost me enough, but now, with Thanksgiving approaching, I felt the old fracture lines inside me, fissures where duty and longing still pressed against one another. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a sky the color of tin, clouds layered thick and brittle. I loaded the trunk of my old Subaru with a bottle of Merlot wrapped in tissue paper for Ethan and a soft wool scarf I'd chosen for Harper. The scarf was pale gray with thin blue stripes. Understated. The kind of gift meant to bridge distance without presumption. As I turned onto the highway, the landscape stretched wide and silent. The open fields of southern Idaho had already surrendered to winter. Brown earth rhymed with frost. Trees standing bare like sketches against the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel, steady but tense. The road between Boise and Idaho Falls was familiar, yet it carried the weight of something larger than distance. I filled the silence of the car with rehearsed words. How's work? Ethan. I practiced in a cheerful tone. The house looks wonderful. I rehearsed a laugh, the kind mothers give to ease tension. Each phrase felt like a patch sewn over old scars. I told myself that if I could keep the conversation light, if I could step around the past carefully, maybe the visit would feel like home again. Forgiveness was harder to practice. As the miles passed, I forced myself to remember Ethan as a boy who collected baseball cards, whose laughter once filled the small kitchen of our Boise duplex. I tried to picture Harper through softer eyes, as a woman managing her own struggles, rather than a wall between me and my son. It was easier said than done, but I pressed on. Somewhere outside of Mountain Home, snowflakes began to scatter across the windshield, melting before the wipers brushed them away. I thought about turning back, just for a moment. Then I tightened my grip, focusing on the road ahead. The bottle of wine clinked softly against the scarf in the back seat, reminders of the fragile hope I carried with me. I told myself this trip could be a new chapter, that holidays could still mean something other than tension and loss. With the gray sky closing in, I drove on toward Idaho Falls. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon as I stepped inside. A fragrance pulled straight from memory yet arranged too neatly, like a scene rehearsed for guests. Harper greeted me with a smile that touched her lips, but not her eyes. And Ethan's hug was firm, almost theatrical, as though he wanted to prove something before anyone else could question it. In the dining room, the table gleamed under a chandelier I didn't remember from before. The golden turkey sat at the center, flanked by bowls of mashed potatoes whipped smooth, green beans scattered with slivered almonds, cranberry sauce in a crystal dish. Every detail seemed staged to photograph well, though no camera was present. I placed the wine on the counter, the scarf folded carefully in its box, and settled into my seat. Conversation began in bursts. Ethan recounting a story about a new property he was developing, his voice pitched higher, carrying more pride than certainty. He spoke of investors, of future profits, his hands cutting the air as if to shape buildings only he could see. Harper added small comments, perfectly timed, her tone sweetened with encouragement. But her gaze flicked toward me between sentences, calculating. How's retirement treating you? Marjorie, she asked, leaning forward as if to soften the question. I imagine you must feel secure. After all your years at the library, her words carried a polished edge. Secure. The word landed like an assessment, not curiosity. I smiled politely, answering vaguely about walks along the river and good books. Ethan jumped back in, listing plans for another venture, his enthusiasm sharp, too sharp. My fork traced circles in the mashed potatoes while I listened, heart heavy with the sense that I was not being spoken to but measured. From the far end of the table, Grandpa Henry sat quietly, his cane resting against his chair. At 84, his eyes missed nothing. He watched Ethan's hands, Harper's careful tone, and he caught me glancing his way. His brow furrowed slightly, as if he recognized the pattern unfolding again, one I had promised myself never to repeat. The turkey cooled as their questions warmed, when the plates had been cleared and the leftovers packed away. Harper dimmed the chandelier until the light softened across the room. Ethan disappeared briefly into the hallway and returned carrying a small, square box wrapped in velvet. He set it in front of me with both hands, smiling too broadly. "For you, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a weight that didn't match the gesture. My fingers hesitated over the lid. The box was heavier than I expected, its corners firm, its purpose unclear. I thought perhaps a pendant, or a keepsake of some kind, something to mark this attempt at togetherness. For a brief second, I let myself believe. Inside was no jewelry, only a folded document, crisp edges gleaming under the lamplight. I unfolded it slowly, and the black print came into focus, a bank notice. Payment past due. Balance listed in bold $280,000. My chest tightened, as though the air had been drawn out of the room. Ethan leaned forward, elbows pressing the table. "It's my debt, Mom. But you'll cover this. Families help each other." His tone wasn't a plea, it was a directive. A decision already made. I stared at him, then at Harper. Her smile was gone, replaced by a composed stillness. She rested her manicured hands on the table and spoke evenly. "You have the means. I know because I work at the bank. Marjorie, I've seen the accounts. 700,000 saved, neat and untouched. You can afford this." The words cut deeper than the notice itself. Years of late nights, skipped vacations, careful discipline all stripped down to numbers read aloud like a balance sheet. Privacy turned to leverage. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Ethan's eyes bore into me, expectant, entitled. Harper's expression didn't waver. She looked at me not as family, but as a resource to be tapped. I folded the paper carefully, setting it back on the table between us. My hands trembled, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "This isn't mine to carry." The words hung in the air like frost. Ethan blinked as if he hadn't heard me correctly, then leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Mom, you don't understand. This isn't optional. The bank is pressuring me, and if I default, everything I've built collapses. You have the money just sitting there." I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. "It's not sitting there. It's my life, Ethan, my years of saving, my security, and your choices brought you here, not mine." His cheeks flushed. He slammed his palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "I'm your son if you won't help me." "Who will?" Harper's voice slid in, smoother but sharper. "You can easily afford this. Marjorie, you live modestly. You don't travel. You don't splurge. What's 700,000 for if not to support family when it matters? This isn't even half." I stared at her, at the confidence in her tone, the casual way she dissected my sacrifices. "That money is not for you to decide," I said quietly. Ethan pushed his chair back, scraping against the floor. "After everything I've done, after all the years," he stopped short, the sentence hollow even to his own ears. My heart pounded, but I forced my breath steady. For decades, I had bent, adjusted, paid, excused. Every compromise had been wrapped in the word love. Tonight, that word had been twisted into a weapon. I looked at my son, then at his wife. "I won't do this. Not again. Not ever." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. Harper's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The clock ticked once, twice, echoing against the walls. For the first time in years, I felt the solid ground of my own refusal beneath me. Ethan's face twisted, his eyes bright with anger. He reached for his glass. The stem clenched so tightly it squealed in his grip. In one swift motion, he flung it forward. The wine splashed across my face, cold and sticky, staining my blouse in a deep scarlet bloom. For a moment, the room froze, the crackle of the fireplace, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the sound of breath seemed to vanish. Then the gasps came, sharp and scattered. Before silence clamped down again, I pressed a trembling hand to my cheek, the liquid dripping down my jaw. The humiliation burned hotter than the sting of alcohol in my eyes. My own son had marked me like an enemy, in front of his wife, in front of his grandfather. "Get out!" Harper's voice sliced through the stillness, shrill and commanding. She stood from her chair, pointing toward the door as if I were a trespasser. Her face was taut, her jaw locked, every line of her body rigid with contempt. I pushed my chair back slowly, its legs groaning against the floor. My fingers fumbled for my coat draped over the back. The scarf I'd brought for Harper slipped from its box, landing in a soft heap on the floor. Neither she nor Ethan stooped to pick it up. I slipped my arms into my sleeves, head bowed to hide the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Each movement felt heavy, as though I were carrying not just fabric, but the weight of years of small sacrifices, each one dismissed, erased in this final gesture of rejection. As I turned toward the door, I felt another gaze upon me. Grandpa Henry sat in his chair near the window, hands folded over the knob of his cane. His eyes were fixed on me, sharp and steady, watching without a word. He didn't rise, but something in his expression rooted me for a moment, an unspoken acknowledgement, a warning, perhaps even a promise. I pulled the door open, the cold air rushing in to meet me, and stepped into the night. The cold air bit into my skin as I walked down the porch steps, but I didn't keep going. I stood in the driveway, heart racing, my blouse clinging damp with wine. The night was quiet, brittle with frost, and behind me the house glowed warm and false. I thought of driving away, leaving it all behind. Instead, I found myself circling back to the side door, the one that led into the den where Grandpa Henry kept his papers. He was there, waiting, as if he'd known I wouldn't leave for good, without a word. He reached into the drawer of a small oak desk and pulled out a worn envelope. His hands shook, but his eyes never wavered. "You'll need this," he murmured, pressing it into my palm. Inside were photocopies and statements, withdrawals from casinos in Nevada, purchases of a BMW and flights to Paris, balances that matched the debt Ethan had just tried to pin on me. And tucked at the back, a single page printed with Harper's login trail at the bank, proof she had accessed my accounts without permission. 30 minutes after I'd been thrown out, I walked back into the dining room. The chatter died instantly. Ethan stood frozen by the fireplace. Harper's arms crossed tight over her chest. I laid the papers on the polished table, smoothing them flat with deliberate care. The lamplight caught the numbers, each one loud on the page. "This," I said evenly, "is the truth you hoped I'd carry alone." Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came. Harper's face stiffened, color draining as she recognized her own name on the records. Grandpa Henry followed me inside, leaning heavily on his cane. He tapped it once against the floor, the sound sharp as a gavel. The room fell silent. All the performance, the perfect meal, the forced smiles, The rehearsed warmth shattered in an instant under the weight of evidence. No one moved. The silence of that night didn't stay contained within four walls. Within days, whispers carried through Idaho Falls, rippling outward until truth replaced the polished stories Ethan and Harper had built around themselves. By the end of the week, the church pew they once filled with easy smiles sat empty. Friends avoided their eyes at the grocery store. Neighbors who used to wave from their driveways turned their backs. Extended family heard. Too. Aunt Margaret called me from Twin Falls, her voice hushed but firm. We didn't know the extent of it. Marjorie, we're with you. Soon after, Uncle Ray left a message on my phone, saying he had always suspected Ethan's ventures weren't what he claimed. Their support steadied me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. At the bank, Harper's composure cracked under the weight of investigation. Clients withdrew accounts. An ethics committee convened to review her unauthorized access. Her violation of trust. The once flawless woman who measured me with numbers now faced numbers that condemned her. For Ethan, creditors began knocking. The BMW he had paraded through town was repossessed in the middle of the night. Notices piled at his door, debts he could no longer shuffle or disguise. The investors he had boasted about demanded explanations he couldn't give. His name, once paired with ambition, now carried only failure. I watched all this unfold from the quiet of my Boise apartment. News reached me in phone calls, in quiet conversations at the library where old colleagues still worked, in the occasional letter slipped under my door from family who had heard sorrow pressed against me at times, the ache of a mother who wished her son had chosen differently, who wished love hadn't curdled into entitlement, and yet beneath the sorrow was a strange calm, a liberation I hadn't expected. For the first time in decades, no one was leaning on me to solve their crises. My money sat untouched, my days my own. I could breathe without waiting for the next request, the next demand. From the ruins of their schemes, I found space enough to stand. Back in Boise, the days began to feel different. I opened new accounts at a smaller credit union, locked down every password, and placed a freeze on my credit. The motions felt less like paranoia and more like planting fence posts, clear lines that belonged to me alone. Each morning, I laced up my sneakers and ran the river path. The November air cut sharp in my lungs, but the rhythm steadied me. Step by step, I felt the residue of old obligations fall away. I was no longer carrying debts that weren't mine, no longer rehearsing how to say no. The quiet freedom of my own apartment became a gift I hadn't recognized before. Grandpa Henry began calling every Sunday afternoon. His voice was slower now, but steady, filled with warmth. He didn't mention the wine or the shouting. He simply asked about my runs, about the weather along the Greenbelt, about the tomatoes he still tried to coax from his winter garden. At the end of each call, he said the same thing: "I'm proud of you, Marjorie." Those words carried more weight than any check I had ever written. Invitations started arriving from other corners. Too, my Aunt Margaret insisted I come for Sunday dinner the next time I was in Twin Falls. My cousins sent photos of crowded tables, paper plates piled high, children laughing. Their messages didn't ask for money or favors, only my presence. For once, belonging wasn't conditional. At night, I often thought about forgiveness, not as a door left unlocked, waiting for Ethan and Harper to stroll back in unchanged, but as a gate I built myself. A gate with a lock and a key I controlled. I could choose when it opened, if it ever did, and to whom. They might call it betrayal, the way I stepped away, the way I held my silence, but to me, it was the first honest act of love I had shown myself.